Well, hello and thank you for joining me for another Alex on Tech and iTWire TV interview. I'm joined today by Barry Palte. He is the founder and chairman of EQ Capital Partners, an impact investor with over 35 years of experience and career in the world of finance. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex. A pleasure to be with you.
Great to be with you too. Now, Barry, the first question to ask is, what is impact investing and where did this trend come from?
Well, if I take the second part of your question first, Alex, where did it come from? It's been building up a head of steam now for decades, actually, as deep, thoughtful investors have started to think not just about the financial returns that they get from their investments, but also the very concrete and specific positive social outcomes they can actually generate through the allocation of their capital. And it's picked up more and more, supported basically by events in the world. So, we're living through one right at the moment in terms of the pandemic, climate change. So all of these things have got a lot of investors globally starting to think about what they personally can do to make a difference. In terms of a definition of what impact investing is, it might help. I've actually got a slide that I could put up, Alex.
Please, put it up.
Just to help frame that. And I guess can you see that okay?
No, it hasn't popped up yet.
I need to share the screen, sorry. One
That's
second.
it, no worries.
There you go. There's the share screen. This sets out a spectrum of how investors might think about their investment decision making and the allocation of that capital. On the right-hand side, is really the traditional way of looking at it, which is basically financial returns, right? So internal rates of return, we put money in, what do we get out, when do we get it out? And that's still there as an underlying driver. But on the left-hand side of that spectrum is really almost charities, philanthropy. And in the middle is really where I would say the definition of impact investing is now heading, which is, it's a mix of both, right? It's still looking to generate good financial returns, but it's actually looking explicitly to make concrete social outcomes delivered through that investment. And that, it's all along that spectrum. You can choose where you want to be. But the big trend to me is that the big shift from many, many investors around the world from thinking purely about investment returns and financial returns to incorporating other elements into their decision making.
I mean, we've heard about investors deciding not to invest in tobacco producing companies, for example, or in various mining companies. So, I mean, this idea of directing your investments has been around for a long time. And of course, the individual is the ultimate decider of where they wanted to invest. And so there could have been people doing this for a long time. But of course, now it really has become a trend.
Yeah, very much so. And you touched on something which is the starting point almost to get people who are thinking about how to move into impact investing. Almost the first step was to start thinking about doing no harm, right? So don't invest in things that will actually cause very direct harm. But then, there's almost a series of steps that people go through where they move from not for harm to what I call investing with impact, right? So it's basically, you now explicitly make sure you do no harm, but you're starting to measure how you actually start generating impact. And then the final piece almost is when you start off with what is the impact and work backwards from that. And that I think is a natural transition as people get to understand the power of what they can do with their capital.
Now, I did a little bit of reading about you and watched some video interviews and read some of the documents that are out there. And one of the things you spoke about was investing in disruptive technologies. I mean, I'm a big believer that technology is what will solve a lot of the problems that we've created in the past. The faster, more dense form of batteries or solar panels with, 3 times the efficiency. I remember the CSIRO talking about how 25% was the holy grail for solar panels, and apparently we've reached that. But then I've heard about all sorts of paints that you can use on your homes, where the paint is able to, do the conversion of the sunlight into electricity, and a lot of those things are sort of still yet to truly be rolled out and commercialized and scaled up. But in any case, technology, you talk about disruptive technologies that better the health of the people and the health of the planet. And on your site, you say you focus on food and agriculture, social infrastructure, healthcare and biotech, and the circular economy. So I was wondering if you could please give us some examples of the companies you've invested in each of these areas. And what were some of the outcomes? On a lot of the things I've seen you speak about, you talk about getting the social impact, but what are some examples of the actual impacts that you have been able to help create?
Sure. Yeah, I'm delighted to share that, Alex. And so I guess if I start off with food and ag tech, which is a major component of what I focus on. One of the companies I've invested in is actually a Canadian company called MustGrow. MustGrow spent the key technical people behind it, who are a lot of professors and PhDs, which is sort of what I like to look for. Very smart scientists who've actually spent a big chunk of their lives trying to work through major issues. They actually discovered that the mustard seed crop, which we use to make mustard, is actually a very, very effective way of dealing with pest control. Once a certain isolate from the mustard seed crop is actually extracted and then applied in a particular way. I met the company actually during our Zoom life that we've all been living the last 18 months. I invested in the company just over a year ago, actually, and joined the global advisory board. But what they've actually got is a platform technology that can be applied to deal with pests across many, many different types of pests and many, many different types of crops. And because it is a derivative of a natural crop, which is mustard seed, critically, there's no chemicals. And if you look what's happening around the world, many, many chemicals in the production process of food are now being banned outright. And where they aren't, there's very clear evidence of causing harm to us who are eating the food, and then the people who are actually growing the food, high rates of cancer, from various chemicals. So to me, it was a no-brainer looking at this and saying, this is where the world has to go, is going. It was, the technology was well developed, the commercialization was just starting, and this was going to be a globally relevant company. And so it's proven to be. Just recently, actually in the last 3 or 4 days, the company, amongst other things, about 3 or 4 months ago, announced a major deal with Sumitomo, which is the big Japanese group, to look at the application of the technology just to bananas and potatoes in certain markets in the world. I'll just focus on the bananas, which is a fascinating banana story. But bananas actually have their own coronavirus on steroids. They actually have a disease called Panama disease, which kills approximately 25% of the banana crop globally every year. And once it gets into plantation, that's it. You can't actually use it again. You almost have to burn it down and come back in 5 or 10 years' time. There are no chemical solutions for that disease in the world. And so MustGrow has actually demonstrated in laboratory and now in field trials with Sumitomo, and announced only a few days ago phenomenal results in actually controlling Panama disease, first in the world. So literally every banana grower in the world, once we bring it to market, will be jumping up and down and rejoicing. So that's direct impact, and anybody who eats a banana will be pleased to know they'll be able to keep eating bananas. Yeah.
And I did hear that bananas are clones of each other. So this is when you clone something, that brings its own problems because there's not enough diversity.
You got it. In fact, I don't know if you're a big banana eater in your youth. When you're a child, Alex, I was, and I remember bananas being sweeter, more yellow, when I was actually eating them as a child. And there's a really simple reason for why it's changed, because the previous species of banana that actually were the key genetic species around the world actually could not survive against Panama disease, literally. So the whole banana industry had to swap over about 15 years ago to a new genetic variety to actually keep producing bananas. As fundamental as that. Yeah.
So are there any other examples of companies you've invested in or impacts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, sure. On the healthcare side, I'm an investor in and a director of an Australian company based in Adelaide, which is actually developing a new vaccine for pneumococcal disease, which causes pneumonia, meningitis, and every year kills millions of mostly elderly and young children. around the world. Pre-COVID, this was actually the biggest selling vaccine market in the world, coincidentally also from Pfizer. So Pfizer had a vaccine, still has a vaccine called Prevnar 13. And that's actually a very good vaccine. But a big problem which was emerging, so pneumococcal disease is a bacterial infection rather than a viral infection. Yeah, but the problem is that in the pneumococcal disease space, we've now identified north of 100 serotypes or variations of the disease-causing bacterial pathogens. The problem is that the Prevnar vaccine, which was very effective, is called Prevnar 13 because it dealt with 13 of the variations of the disease-causing pathogens. So a bit like we're experiencing now with coronavirus, getting mutations, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Same issue. And a small Australian company spin out from the University of Adelaide, some phenomenal scientists, spent many years working through how to solve that problem, and have actually developed core technology that we believe, and I have to be very careful what I say here, we believe has a good shot at actually providing a universal coverage against all of the serotypes of the bacterial pathogens. So, we have to prove that, of course. But if we do, then we will have, a totally new vaccine, which could potentially save millions of lives around the world. And we're developing that at speed. I think, the company's been around now for 4.5 years. When I first invested and actually joined the board right in the beginning. This was all pre-COVID, and suddenly the world has woken up and discovered the value of vaccines. So it's been a good time, to be in vaccines. It's a good, financially and from an investment perspective, huge amounts of money going into it. But at core, what drives us all on the board and in the company is how do we save lives?
Yeah. Well, another example of disruptive technology preventing disruption to human lives.
Indeed, keeping us alive. That's a pretty decent thing to do.
Now, you mentioned before about the Musgrow and that you were appointed as a global advisor, the Canadian company that has created the biopesticides and the bioherbicides. And, in an age of where awareness of eating organic food as one of the puzzle pieces of human wellness has never been greater, obviously it's great to see that we have these biopesticides and bioherbicides that can do their magic without polluting the earth and ruining it for future generations. I mean, I was only seeing in an article today about this river. It wasn't the Ganges, but it was another river in India. And there's all this toxic foam from all of these factories that are, putting their waste into the river. And people were going into the river, into the foam for these Diwali celebrations and putting their lives at risk from all this toxicity. So, again, I'm a big believer in technology providing solutions, and we need the R&D and the investors in that technology to get it out of the dream phase and into the scaled up and available to everybody phase. And one of the questions, I guess, is how did you discover Musgrow? How do you find the companies that are worth investing in? It must not be an easy proposition with so many choices out there of where to put your money.
Yeah, I guess the really simple answer is I've been doing it for a long time and actually spent way too much time churning out CO2, flying around the world pre-COVID. So built many global relationships over a very extended period of time. And so I get sent a lot of things. It's quite well known in terms of what my focus is and how I can add value. So I get sent a lot of things. And that's really what, where Musgrow came from, actually came from a very good friend of mine and long-term business colleague who actually was based in Canada and said, I must meet this company given everything. And so this was interesting because I actually invested in Musgrow in September last year, and I've yet to physically face-to-face meet the management team.
Except over Zoom, right?
Except over Zoom.
Yeah.
But that's not face-to-face, right? As in person. So
yeah, absolutely.
We've been forced to adapt, and actually it's proven to be a really effective way of doing things. But at core, I would not have invested if it hadn't been referred to me by somebody that I knew already personally and trusted. So, the very short answer is I've spent a lot of time building global networks, and that's where this continuous deal flow comes. It's almost overwhelming. It is overwhelming.
Well, if you look at the EQ Capital Partners website and you look at the various affiliations that you have and Global Emeritus Chairman and all this sort of stuff, I mean, it's clear that you are very connected in this world, and it's obviously after decades of hard work and a genuine interest in both finance and now, of course, the social impact investing. When did you start your fund?
Oh gosh, I've been investing in disruptive technology for 25 years now. I'd probably be one of the very early stage tech investors in Australia, actually. Doing this, I joke because I wrote the very first check for a very interesting company, 20 more than 20 odd years ago, and actually went in to help the founders set the company up from scratch. It was an enterprise software company, which could well have been, a sort of pre-Atlassian. For those who know what Atlassian is, hugely successful Australian software company. We went and we set up. I said to the founders where we were going to set up, and one of the founders' wives had a fashion showroom in Surrey Hills, and we said, right, well, let's use that. And so we cleared out the fashion showroom, and we put 2 trestle tables and 3 PCs, and off we went, literally. And again, for those who know Sydney, Surrey Hills is now almost the valley in Sydney for tech. I joke again, at the time you could not get a decent coffee anywhere, and there was zero ecosystem. So I've been doing it a long time, Alex, and continue to invest right throughout that time. But you mentioned in passing one of the other roles that I actually developed. So I actually built out my own investment bank with some partners in Australia and China, actually. So I spent a lot of time in China and a lot of other countries around the world. But I built out a business which we then ended up becoming part of a network of 11 investment banks around the world. That was how we got global coverage. And again, possibly because I was the person in the whole network who flew the most, I ended up being asked to be and invited to be the global chairman of the whole international network. So that was 11 investment banks around the world. And again, one of the reasons why I spent a lot of time on planes and built these networks. So it's been a very interesting insight, being both an investor and also as part of that investing, working with the companies to actually help grow their value and do what I call, I describe it, keep the founders safe, because often founders are almost going to a bit of a jungle, and keeping safe in that jungle is a challenge at times.
Well, they need a mentor, they need a wise, experienced hand, and clearly that's where you come in. Now, just to go back quickly to Musgrove for a second, my bamboo, the non-clumping kind, the kind that grows everywhere and is like a weed, is something that my mother and father decided to plant at the family home many years ago, and the thing grows everywhere. And I'm just wondering, do you know, because I mean, if you use a herbicide like Roundup, you're supposed to kill the top, but I read the description on the Musgrove site about how the Musgrove bioherbicide works, and it goes into the root and it gets sucked up and it goes right into the plant. So I'm wondering, could this be the world's first effective bioherbicide against bamboo? And if it is, when can I get some?
Yeah, well, I believe we haven't yet tested on bamboo, but
please ask them to test it, because otherwise we're going to have to dig it all up. I've got a friend who has a thing called a kanga, which is like a, if you think of those Japanese exoskeletons, it's not quite that, but you sit on it and you can put all sorts of drills, and it's sort of like a Tonka truck, except it hasn't got the truck part. You sort of stand there, and we're going to get him to come over and dig the whole thing out, because it only grows so far. But I mean, if I could just spray some of this stuff and have it magically die, that would be great. But I guess it's going to be some time.
We've tested on a lot of different crops, and it seems to work across all of them, actually.
Well, I'm serious. If they want to send me some to try on this bamboo that I've got here, I would love to test it. It'll be very disruptive to the bamboo, I can assure you.
I'll see what I can arrange.
Thank you. Now, what are the criteria that you go by to choose ethical, impactful, and profitable investments?
Yeah. So I've got a really simple metric or system, almost process, which I call the hell yes or hell no process, right? So the hell yes process is I need to spend the time, get to understand what it is, and at the end of it, I have to say, hell yes, I really want to do this. All the things line up for a whole range of reasons, which I'll go through. And if it's not a hell yes, it's a hell no. So it's very, very, it's very clear and actually almost simple. So the starting point, actually, one of the first things I ask, the founders of companies is, so how do you define your social impact? What is your social impact that you're actually going to be delivering to the world? And it's really important to me. And if there's this sort of pregnant pause, and then it's ums and ahs, and then there's no real answer, then I know they haven't even thought about it. And so it's almost certainly going to be a pass, even at that very early stage. But if they get through that, that's almost the first gate. The second gate is really the people, right? Really getting to understand. I want to work with good people and be around the right energy, and people who really want to make a difference. And that, to me, is absolutely critical. And so I go through all of that. Of course, before I take the meeting, I'll try to understand what it is that they're actually doing. But that's the first thing that I will look at once I've met them, and then I'll go into my own view of how the impact can actually be delivered through the technology, and follow that up then with a bit more, I guess, almost traditional financial metrics. So how big is it, right? So what I'm looking for is the things that I invest in. Can we genuinely impact 1 billion people, right? If it's going to impact 10 people, then it's not for me, right? So I guess the scale of the impact, the timing is actually a really interesting one. So it's the not too early, not too late thing, right? So it's a very, very, very common issue in all sorts of technology, not just the technologies I invest in. iTWire, if you look at the development of the information technology industry, same thing, right? And we all carry these amazing smartphones now, but there were very early versions of sort of smartphones, and I'm racking my brain now, but it was
the Sony Ericsson, the A1000, maybe it was from Motorola. It was a large
even before that,
the Pocket PC.
Sinclair, that's right. There was the Sinclair, right? I don't know. I'm dating myself now, but there was this Clive Sinclair, I think it was, who actually came out with basically the prototype for a smartphone 20 years before smartphones, but too early, right? And then if you're too late, then you miss it. So that's another key part of it. And then, really trying to understand, the numbers are important. Trying to understand the metrics around the numbers, and, businesses which are very capital intensive, I've tended to stay away from, because, it's a different type of investing.
Money pit.
And, but equally needed, right? If we're going to be, actually, a company I didn't end up investing in, but a very fantastic technology company, is actually an Australian company that last week actually won the startup competition for climate change solutions in Edinburgh. They actually came first out of 2,700 companies. Amazing company. Technology is great. But where that technology will end up is in building large processing plants to actually capture CO2 from industrial processes. And each of those plants will cost 100 million US plus. And it's just not the sort of thing that I'm focused on. So I leave that to other people who are prepared to do that.
Now, you mentioned the must grow with the biopesticides and bioherbicides. And you also mentioned that you're working on the vaccines to eliminate meningococcal disease. Are there any more examples of any more examples of the outcomes you've achieved through social impact investing that have changed the world and made a massive difference?
Yeah. So I'll take another one from the healthcare side, where I was an early investor in a Boston company called Minerva Biotherapies, which was actually, the founder there was the second person in Harvard's history to get an unsupervised PhD. So that's quite amazing. The only other person at the time who got that ended up being a Nobel Prize winner. So very, very smart woman who'd done huge amounts of work in stem cell technologies, and it actually developed a whole what's called an induced pluripotent stem cell system, which is basically taking stem cells all the way back to their state when we first were created, were first conceived. So she's done a huge. I won't go deep into the technical side now for your listeners, but she created this system, and then while she was doing that, she started realizing that gave her insights into how cancer stem cells actually grew. So cancer is actually fundamentally, as humans, we all have a whole bunch of cells inside us, and they grow, they actually die, they get replaced. That's a very natural process. Cancer cells don't die, they keep growing, and that's fundamentally what cancer is. So off the back of that, she then started identifying some very, very fundamental triggers around that cancer growth. And she spent another 10 years of her life, and I invested in that company 6-7 years ago, developing cancer treatments, where she believes, and the founder actually, her mother died of breast cancer, and she has 5 daughters, and 4 of her daughters have the gene that predisposes them to breast cancer. So she was on an absolute mission. And so she spent her life basically developing a system to actually deal with solid state tumors. And you may have heard, Alex, about CAR-T and cancer immunotherapy treatments, which basically juice up the immune system of the body. So a bit like is happening with the coronavirus vaccines now, and the mRNA. So, but in a cancer environment. So there've been some very successful drugs there. But yeah, well, actually, drugs have actually had phenomenal success, but they've mostly been in blood-borne cancers as opposed to solid-state tumors. And her technology is focused on solid-state tumors, and she believes, again, a big statement, could get to 85% of all solid-state tumors, regardless where they sit in the body. That was one of her key insights, that we tend to think about breast cancer or prostate cancer, but cancer is fundamentally the underlying mechanism of cancer is the same. So she's now in clinical trials, literally with people who are 3 to 4 weeks, 8 weeks away from death, and applying that technology to those people and getting some phenomenal results. So some of those people will still unfortunately pass away, but this is all part of the development of science, and we could get to a point where she feels strongly. Her name is Cynthia Bamdad. Cynthia feels very strongly that we could end up with a cancer vaccine. So you take a vaccine and you don't get cancer. So quite phenomenal.
Yeah, I remember some years ago, one of my brother's colleagues had some sort of a skin cancer that got worse and worse, and he was put onto some sort of experimental drug, and all of the lesions disappeared. But somehow the balance wasn't right, and within a couple of months it all came back, and he passed away. But I mean, to see, and I only had the story from my brother, but to see him clear up and things go back to normal, at least for a while, was just an incredible thing. And this is the promise again of technology, the disruption that technology can bring. And it makes me want to ask you, without giving any secrets away, are there any other disruptive technologies that you have your eye on or that have interested you?
Yeah, many actually. I think it's I see a lot. The
question is, which ones are worth investing in?
Sure. Yeah. So one technology company, we're just in the assessment process. I obviously can't disclose details, but almost certainly we will go ahead and invest. He's actually developed a technology which has all the properties of plastic, and is actually derived from the same raw materials that go into producing plastics. So, it's stretchy, it's strong, it's all those sorts of things. But it's been engineered so that when it hits moisture, it actually melts. And even better than that, the technology has been refined to the point where it can be almost tuned to melt according to how much moisture is actually applied to it. So, the obvious practical reason for that is, let's say you're using this technology to take your shopping home, you get caught in the rain and it melts. It's not going to be a great outcome, right?
Yeah, you wouldn't use it for carrying water.
No, you'd have a problem, right? Well, no, you might use it for carrying water, but you'd use the one where it would dissolve over time. You'd actually know. I mean, it's been so tuned by the founders. Again, genius scientists. It's been tuned to the point where they can work out. This one will last for 5 hours with this amount of moisture before it starts melting. Why is that important? It is so critical. I think a lot of people would have heard about the plastic. The plastic in the oceans. Literally islands of plastic. And it's now getting more and more known how intrusive that plastic is in so many different ways, right? So I was actually looking at another company recently, which is actually an electric vehicle related technology around batteries, and just talking to the founder. And what it turns out is that, interestingly, the batteries were quite heavy. So batteries in an electric vehicle actually make the overall vehicle quite heavy and actually hug close to the ground. And one of the unintended side effects is that you get way more wear and tear on the tires. So, and we don't see it as humans easily, but literally microplastics come off your tires and end up going into the atmosphere and then into the water system and into the food system. And that's a major, major issue, right? In some of the Scandinavian countries, they actually found that, the particles coming off the tires actually responsible for up to 50% of the microplastics in water systems. So, that's what we're trying to solve. And we've got you've got a lot of big companies, like the big bottling companies, Coca-Cola's of the world, and they're now saying, well, they have to do something, right? But they still need something to put the Coke in, Coca-Cola, and so this can be a perfect solution for them. It's no longer enough to just say I take it to a point where the consumer uses it. What happens after that?
Yeah, and clearly when it does biodegrade in water, what it biodegrades into is something that is not an additional pollutant, but somehow is biodegrading in a way that is safe.
Well, actually, Alex, you can actually put, the founder's got a great video where, glass of water, and you put this, it's not, it's plastic-like, you put it in, it dissolves, and then you just drink the water, literally. And it's safe.
Well, that will be a revolutionary thing, because we've seen, as you said, the terrible things about plastic and all these plastic bag bans. All they've done is taken thin plastics and replaced it with thick plastics. So some of the solutions have been, I think, worse than the cure. But when they're companies working on real solutions,
there's a great point there, which is that this is actually something that can be bolted on to the end of a sort of petrochemical refining plant. So we're still going to need some sort of fossil fuels to take us through the transition. So all those plants are going to be keeping going for some time. But instead of the output going into plastics, which then cause more problems, you can actually tag this onto the end of those plants and actually produce something that doesn't cause damage. So you can work partly within the system as the system evolves, and I think we need to do that, to sort of get to all the goals that we're trying to get to as humanity.
Yeah. Now, Barry, one always interesting question is, what gave you the idea to start investing in this way? What in your past was the catalyst?
Well, there's a couple of components, I guess, to that. I mean, one is, why social impact? And then the second thing, I guess, is my particular focus within that. So if I take the first of that, why social impact? Really, it fundamentally goes back to my childhood. So I actually grew up in Zimbabwe when it was still called Rhodesia. Actually grew up in my teenage years effectively in a civil war, and that really got me thinking long and hard about the world. And I believe, Alex, you've watched one of the other interviews I've given where I talked about having two mothers, my biological white mother, but also second black mother. And I was equally close to both. And yet there I was in the middle of a civil war where black and white were killing each other just because we had different color skins. And I thought, this is crazy. Why would people actually do that? I've got two mothers and I feel loved by both of them. I love them both. So why does this actually happen this way? So it got me thinking, I don't know, I guess I almost had an awareness as a very young child, very, very young, and just thinking about it and and that really was the trigger. And then the rest of my journey, which I won't go into in sort of extreme detail, but is actually enhanced that, right? I've been very fortunate to spend a lot of time in many, many different countries and different cultures, almost losing track where I've been. And fundamentally, what I found through all of that is that at core, humans ultimately want the same thing. We've got different cultures which should be respected. We've got different religions. We've got different languages. But at core, people would rather prefer to be having a good life and not killing each other. And that's really what's driven me. So in terms of the technology, technology focus, so I'm not a PhD, not a professor. In my sort of technical background, I'm actually trained as an actuary in sort of advanced mathematics and stuff like that. But that always fascinated me, the deep technical science part of it, without actually being a scientist. Maybe, I was intrigued about being one and wasn't one. So what I ended up doing was actually spending time around a lot of very, very smart scientists and getting my quasi PhD just by being around them. But fundamentally, my view was that deep technology could actually have a fundamental impact. So I personally could have the greatest impact myself by leveraging through the impact that those technology could have.
Yeah. So investment people will be curious to know, how does your investment success compare with traditional investment strategies?
I say very, very explicitly that doing social impact investing is not at the expense of financial returns. In fact, it's the opposite. Right? So, and I can give examples. Just again, I'll use it because it's a public company, so I can't disclose anything on private companies. But Must Grow is actually a listed company in Canada. I engaged with the company and I actually invested, just over 12 months ago. The share price since I invested is up 12 times, 1,200%. So, that was just looking at it and saying, this is just, it's a no-brainer. The world needs this. Separately, I do have another part of my investing activity, which you referred to, which is social infrastructure. And there, actually, my main focus currently there is actually in social housing, and actually in the United States. So I've actually partnered and co-investing with a couple of families that I've known for a very long time. In fact, one of them, to be accurate, I've known for a very long time, and the second one I've got to know very well. And they're a leader in the multi-family apartment market in the US in very, very tough neighborhoods, hugely tough neighborhoods. So going into areas which desperately need proper accommodation, but doing it for profit. So this is not social housing, not for profit. The company has been incredibly successful. So, we actually measure our investment returns on individual projects. We've now done well over $1 billion of projects. We've got a pipeline of over $1 billion US, and we systematically working through that. And the historic investment returns for social housing have been in excess of 70% internal rates of return per annum, right? So for anybody who's been in property would know that's stellar, particularly when interest rates are 2% at the moment, or 1% in the world. So incredible, right? And we can explicitly show that we are actually changing those neighborhoods. So some of the areas we've been into, one of my partners is this force of nature. It's almost from Hollywood Central Casting, ex-Special Forces guy, but has been doing this for 35 years himself. He'll go into these tough neighborhoods where the local police force in the US would say, you should not be investing there. You shouldn't be going there. You're going to get shot, right? And he laughs, right? And so, one of our projects was in an area around the Atlanta airport, which had huge crime rates, and the local police force were getting call-outs every day or every 2 days. And we redeveloped a number of the apartment buildings there and changed the neighborhood and also the social infrastructure around that. And suddenly the police force were getting called out once every 3 months. So that is as explicit social impact as you can possibly give. And people who wanted a safe place to live, couldn't afford to be in different neighborhoods, suddenly got a great place to live, decent rentals, and investors made huge returns. So it's just win-win-win.
Yeah, just makes you think that humanity.
The company, just to mention the company's name. The company's name is Contour Companies, which is actually based out of Detroit.
And so, what's that name again?
Contour Companies.
Contour Companies.
Contour Companies, which is based out of Detroit. So hugely successful, and very proud to be part of that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it sounds very much like it. But I mean, it just makes you think that, humanity could work together to create a sort of, almost utopia. And we seem to do everything we can to do the opposite, wars and all these crazy stuff. So it's good to see that there are people out there who are trying very hard to lift us up, as opposed to, power, as Alan Jones says, can be used for two things: to pull up or to crush. And too many people seem to enjoy crushing, and not enough, and too many people are pulling the ladder behind them, as they say. But it's good to see that there are people out there who are doing the right thing and a good thing, and have such great examples to back it up.
Yeah, I'm optimistic, Alex, right? Because I guess possibly because I tend to only surround myself with optimistic people who believe things can be achieved. But there is a critical mass of people around the world of all sorts, right around the world, who are actually actively working hard to make a difference. And again, I'm tapping in and doing things in actually a very significant number of parts of the world. It's almost, sometimes I wake up and say, 24 hours is not enough for sure.
Yeah.
But for example, just been having some discussions with a very interesting company based in Africa. So doing things in Africa where, as part of my heritage, which is actually the most phenomenal company. It's actually been around for 20 years. It's serving 9 million small-scale farmers in West Africa, providing a whole range of services for them. And you and I were talking just before we started about various forms of smartphones and the like. That business was actually kicked off by actually providing what the founder called device as a service. So providing not a sort of top end smartphone like some of the ones you were showing me, Alex, but a usable phone that actually had functionality, and providing that for $5 or $6 a month as a rental. And then off the back of that, bringing those 9 million, literally there are 9 million consumers, customers on that into the digital world, and providing them access to a whole range of things. And that company is phenomenal. It's actually heading towards a listing on the New York Stock Exchange. Started 20 years ago in Africa. Not many people would have heard about it, but they will very soon hear all about it.
Well, I'm sure over the past 20 years, I have heard of companies in Africa that were providing people with 2G smartphones when the rest of the world was on 3G. And so very basic sort of Nokias, but they were able to log in and do simple banking and get weather information and get all this information even on a tiny little 1-inch green screen that they would never have been able to get before. Yeah. And that was making a big impact back then. But of course, nowadays with, a decent, inexpensive smartphone for $100 Australian, which would be even less in US dollars, giving you the full screen in the Google Maps and the live streaming and everything else. I mean, the ability to change the lives of these small-scale farmers in Africa is immense, and clearly this company is helping to make that a true game changer.
Yeah, and to give you an idea of the social impact there, so I think the system you were talking about is most likely M-Pesa, which was actually in Kenya, right? Which is exactly that. It was like 2G phones, and one of the big problems for the small scale farmers, how could they actually sell and get paid for what they're doing, and suddenly and how could they learn about the weather? It's about to come and destroy their crop. Hugely successful. But the founders of the other company, it's actually a company called Tingo. They're within their core value set is they want to reduce the cost of participation of those farmers in the full society and economy, right? And if you look at some of the fees that small scale consumers have to pay around the world in financial services, for example, a lot of cross-border remittances, people working in one country, sending it back to their family in another country, and often paying up to 20% of the amount of money that they're sending in fees. Crazy. It's not fair, right? Now, this company is looking to get all of those sorts of fees down to no more than 1%, right? So it's just phenomenal.
That'll have quite a social impact.
Absolutely, yeah. And get people participating. It's just like one of my favorite anecdotes, just focusing just briefly on Africa, was a story I read about 6 or 8 weeks ago about I think it was the president of Ghana actually went to visit Switzerland to have a meeting with the president of Switzerland, and said to him, and Ghana provides about 70% of the cocoa that is put into Swiss chocolate, which I'm addicted to. I'm addicted to chocolate, full stop. But particularly Swiss chocolate. And the president of Ghana said, we're going to stop selling our cocoa to you, to your Swiss chocolate industry. And the president said, you can't do that. And he said, well, it's really simple. The Swiss chocolate industry generates $200 billion a year in turnover revenue, and we get $6 billion of that 200. It's not fair, right? So you start thinking about, that's another key part of financial inclusion and the systems to share the value that gets created. It's a huge opportunity. Which a whole other topic, but blockchain and everything around that can actually play a key piece in actually enabling.
Well, that was going to be my next question. What are your thoughts on blockchain and cryptocurrencies and the opportunities they provide in the current market?
I got interviewed on blockchain and cryptos and ICOs, and 3 or 4 years ago, and at the time, what I said is 90% of it is fraud. And I believed it. A lot of the ICOs were not backed by much at all. But if you decompose it, blockchain fundamentally has been around. There's nothing new under the sun, Alex. So again, a blockchain-like system has actually been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there's actually a system back in United Kingdom in I think it's probably the 1500s or the 1600s. It was actually called tally sticks. So if I was going to borrow, 1 guinea from you, 1 sterling, £1 from you, we get a stick and we'd actually break it in half. And the borrower and the lender would each take the one half of the stick. And then when the money was due to be paid back, you'd come and the borrower would hand back the stick and pay the money. And that was the confirmation of the transaction. That's blockchain, right? It's a digital. The difference being it's digital, it's global, it's distributed, right? Supposedly not controlled by anybody. But that's fundamentally what it's about. One of the funny stories that somebody once told me about the tally sticks was that supposedly one of the great fires of London was actually triggered by all of the people who owed money burning all their tally sticks, so they didn't have any proof that they owed the money. That sort of brings me back to the situation we're in now, where just money almost seems to have no value, right? You just keep printing it, and so what the people who owe the money say? Well, maybe we'll never pay it back, right? We'll see.
Yeah, inflating the debts away, never a good thing for economic stability and for trust in the system and for businesses being able to plan. And it's stagflation, inflation's a nightmare, just a nightmare.
Well, my home country where I got born, Zimbabwe, is the ultimate example in recent times, right?
Yeah, absolutely. $1 trillion notes.
$1 trillion notes. And one of my friends actually was in Zimbabwe and went to a restaurant. They wouldn't accept a credit card because between the time you paid and they got settled, it was, it had declined in value by 80 or 90%. So he literally had to take a big plastic bag. Hopefully he should use the plastic I was telling you about, but with a non-plastic plastic. And he had to take a big bag of currency and physically take it to him. He said it was like carrying a brick, right? It was so heavy.
Yeah.
And each of the notes was like $1 trillion. So that's what happens.
And that's a replay of the Weimar Republic where they were carrying banknotes around in wheelbarrows just to buy a loaf of bread.
Correct. Yeah, correct. So to your earlier question, what's my view on blockchain? So, been a very strong believer in the blockchain infrastructure component, a bit like the internet, right? So, we had the .com craze in the early 2000s and lots of fraud and lots of strange things happening. But then off the back of that, we got a whole new system and economy and huge wealth got created through big companies like Amazon and Google and things like that. But for every one of the Amazon and Googles, there are 100 of those companies that fell by the wayside. I actually brings back a memory. I actually was on a plane. I think would have been in early 2000 in the US, and just happened to sit next to the marketing director of Pets.com, which is an infamous example of .coms. And she was telling me they just raised $150 million. And I was saying, what's the business model? Well, we're going to sell stuff online. Okay, and they went bust. Shortly afterwards. So it's a natural, some might say it's creative, destructive capitalism at work, and the winners win. But I think increasingly, particularly in the last 12, 18 months, real, genuine use cases for actually applying that technology are actually now emerging, and they are real. And I'm fascinated. One of my very good friends actually was in El Salvador quite recently, actually meeting with the government. And the El Salvadorian government has actually just, they've just accepted Bitcoin as
legal tender.
Legal tender, yeah. And he was fascinated, right? Because effectively, he's a deep historical and philosophical, cultural thinker, and saying, he went into shops and he was looking at the shopkeepers. Now you can pay with Bitcoin, and they hadn't quite got it, but then they're slowly getting to realize that this was a way for them to take back more control of their lives. And so he was, he thought this fantastic development, and it had to happen because, there was a new prime minister, I believe, in El Salvador, came in and said, we're in such a bad state, we've got to do something different. So in the case of Zimbabwe, they just said, we'll go on to the US dollar, right, overnight. That was their solution. So El Salvador said, we're not going on the US dollar. The US dollar has been part of our problem, actually, more than anything else. So let's go on to something else. Let's pick Bitcoin.
And one of the articles I was reading about, where you were talking about Bitcoin, the statement was made in the article that the Bitcoins and blockchains were the missing part of the internet that hadn't quite been sorted out yet, which was a way for fair value to be determined for everything by the people, as opposed to having central banks or governments inflate things away and really cause schisms in the market that shouldn't have been there.
Yeah, I mean, almost at a very deep philosophical level. If you look at the internet, I mean, the internet has effectively democratized access to information. What enables those 9 million small-scale farmers in Nigeria, to actually access the world is because they've got this little device which gives them information, and that's democratized a whole range of things around that. The missing piece has been around the democratization of the assessment of value and the exchange of that value. So who is to say that one US dollar is worth $2 Australian or 75 cents Australian? The market sets it and the central bank sets it, and that's fine, right? In a more, who is to say when one company is buying another, or let's take it back from a different angle. As an investor, I walk in and I look at a company and I say, it's worth that much, and that's what I'm prepared to pay for the equity in that. But what if that got outsourced effectively, got decentralized? I mean, we talk about crowdfunding. That's one element of it, but the people who are being impacted by the things that are being developed start actually having input to not just the financial value, but the social impact value. And at that point, and then they get to vote with their money, right? Or their, whatever their money, or something else it might be called. They get to vote on that. And that, to me, is the missing piece, right? So, when the internet was starting and the e-commerce was starting, we had how do you pay safely on the internet, right? So we'll have this thing called PayPal, but you still have to use a credit card. And then it was, okay, well, maybe there's a different way to do it. And now we'll have cryptos. So I think it's a natural evolution, Alex. And in 20 years' time, we're going to look back and say, wow, like, look, how archaic were we and how we approached things 20 years ago.
Yeah. And just thinking of all those farmers, with their smartphones, solar power is something that it's difficult to power your house. Even if you have a battery that can store the energy from that, it's still only going to power it for a few hours. If you have some extended blackout, the solar panels and the battery you have in your garage is not going to be enough to give you 24-hour power. But it's enough to power a mobile phone. And the solar power batteries are quite inexpensive to make. I'm sure they're affordable enough for those farmers to buy, that if they don't have reliable electricity at home, for whatever reason, because they're in Africa and they don't have the infrastructure there yet, they can still recharge their phones from the sun. So I'm assuming that's how they do it. And that's, everything starts small, but it grows and grows. And, I have a great hope for the technology to I mean, I love reading about 0-point energy modules in sci-fi. We're not quite there yet, where you get limitless power, but one day we'll figure it out. One day.
I'm still waiting. Having spent 20 months not on planes, pretty much being in Australia, I mean, Star Trek was one of my favorite shows growing up, and I want to be beamed up. So anybody who's worked out the beam me up and beam me down technology and it works, please contact me straight away. I'll be your first guinea pig, because I don't want to be on planes anymore.
Well, the other thing that was in Star Trek Discovery season 3, where they time traveled into the future, sort of hundreds of years into the future, they had this idea of programmable matter, where they could sort of take these pens or pencils and they could make things create out of atoms. It's like a replicator without the machinery. And I mean, that is something that's quite incredible too. There's some very, very, very primitive sort of early work on figuring out how that might work, but that would be quite a social impact. So if anyone comes to you with programmable matter, definitely take a look.
Well, I've got a saying, Alex, which is nature is actually simple and elegant, right? Yeah. And it's quite phenomenal what is available at that deep matter level. I mean, it's a whole other topic. I could talk for hours on it, but it's there, right? And science is starting to discover it, but I don't think it's sufficient just for scientists to be looking at. I mean, it's almost a deep set of philosophical and sort of social overlays that need to. How does humanity actually deal with that? Right? Because if we get down to that fundamental matter, which we're starting to discover, what do we do with it?
Now, before I get on to some of the questions I like to ask the people that I'm interviewing about their first computers, what else do we need to know about impact investing, and where can they find more information?
Well,
In a nutshell.
They can do a search, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be interesting.
Absolutely.
You know, how many things would come up with, you know, impact investing. But I might put up. I can quickly put up a couple of slides just to help with
Sure.
that, perhaps.
Please.
Let me find one in particular. Might help.
And just whilst you're doing that, I'm just going to change the view so my picture is there as well. One sec. One sec. There we go. Okay, go for it.
Yeah. So I mean, possibly one key place they could find information all in one place is, and there's the web link at the bottom, impactmanagementproject.com. It's a project which is trying to it provides a forum for building global consensus on how to measure, manage, and report impacts, right? And just on the right-hand side, I mean, this is part of the complexity that we are in at the moment, Alex, which is there's so many different initiatives happening, all of which are coming in from a slightly different, perspective, or, you know, there's overlap. And again, the way it's again almost like most human endeavor, when a new area starts getting developed, there's all these different standards, then eventually they start coalescing around a few smaller standards. And I think we're in that area, but a good place for people to go and look at that website. You'll find a lot of links. You can go and jump on the UN, United Nations website, and go and look at, the United Nations Development Goals, and click through to 1,000 different articles and various areas where you might be able to find things.
So, Barry, as we get towards the end of the interview, I always like to ask if you could please share your memory of your first computer.
Wow. So now I'm actually going to date myself, Alex. But I will share it. In my first year at university, I did advanced mathematics, and part of it was we did some programming. And our programming was then transposed into punch cards. And the punch cards then were sent away overnight to be processed. And then the next day we got back the outcome of our little project that we were meant to do some Boolean logic programming or whatever it was at the time. And that got printed out on this amazing thing called a dot matrix printer. And we got this, like with all these little holes in the paper. And that's what we got. So that was my very first experience of using a computer, but wasn't my own computer. So my very first own computer was at the end of my first year in university. I actually ended up, I had a scholarship at the time and went and worked with a company. And we were doing some financial analysis. And so I got given a Wang computer, right? I don't know if you remember a Wang computer.
Yeah, I remember Wang. Yeah, they had the terminals.
And on the Wang computer, I actually used a predecessor to Excel spreadsheet, right? Which at the time was Multiplan.
Multiplan, yeah.
Multiplan. So my first application on a computer was using Multiplan on a Wang computer, right? And then, so we actually did a spreadsheet, and we actually we put together this big spreadsheet around a particular, it's actually a set of numbers that were going to go into an end-of-year financial report for this company. And the chief actuary at the time, so we printed out the results, right? And I was a bit obsessive at the time, looking at making sure all the formula added up and all that sort of thing on the spreadsheet. So we checked everything, printed it out, handed the results to the chief actuary, and he said, "I can't trust this thing," right? And he pulled out his HP12C, and he literally went and added up every row and every column to make sure it all added up. That was I still remember that pretty clearly.
Yeah, I got my first computer in 1979 when I was 4.5 years old. It was a XCD Sorcerer, and Dad was using, I think, Wang terminals at the public service where he was working for the Department of Trade, or whichever one it was at the time. And I remember hearing all those years ago that there was a very short-lived campaign by Wang. They had a support division, and they called it Wang. And then the second part of the term was CARES, C-A-R-E-S. But they didn't keep it for very long when they were told what it sounded like with a French accent.
They were the dominant. It's interesting that, if I remember right, they were the dominant word processing sort of hardware. It was all hardware and software. It wasn't just software at the time. It was all mixed up in one sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, it was the age of centralized computing. These were the dumb terminals sitting on people's desks, and it was all done on a computer. And then, of course, we had the revolution of the sort of the late 80s with the PC and Windows 95, and it all decentralized back to your desk. And then it all centralized back to mobile phones doing all of their processing in the cloud. And, of course, these days, all of your Siri requests and Google Assistant requests can all be processed on device. So we seem to be going through those cycles and waves of centralization and decentralization. Yeah.
And I think, a key point there for me, as a very, very global investor, is what I do would be impossible without that enabling infrastructure and technology. So for me, physical location ceased to have meaning because, I'm sitting, it's one of the downsides of being stuck in Australia, but, operating on many, many time zones. But, the communication keeps going, whether it's WhatsApp or some other platform. It's just continuous, and it's actually quite efficient because, while you're sleeping a bit, somebody else somewhere else is actually being able to do things. So it brings
very asynchronous.
It opens up opportunities for developing countries as well to be part of the world, which they've not been able to do previously.
Now, I'm sure to explain this properly would take a long time, but what's the short version of your history in the world of finance after you left university, for example, to today? The short version. Left university, qualified as an actuary, finished the qualification and said, it's probably not quite me, and then I was actually in South Africa at the time. I got an English qualification, so I could have gone anywhere in the world, pretty much. But I liked the sun, so I said, where can I go where my qualifications are going to work for me? And it was Australia, so I came to Australia sight unseen. Ended up working for about 12 years in big corporates, and ended up in Australia's largest bank as head of strategy and mergers and acquisitions for all of the non-banking business of Commonwealth Bank. So I was quite young, had a lot of fun, was in corporate, and then looked around and said that I've always been an entrepreneur at heart. I need to go and do this. So almost 25 years ago now, set out on my own, literally set up my shop, set up my shingle and said, I'm going to go and do this. Didn't quite know what I was going to do. Had a one-pager, worked out, so I was my own founder and actually experienced exactly what it felt like to do that. And built over the last 25 years. And as part of that, as I mentioned, I started off, effectively investing in a small number of companies that I could afford at the time, and actually working with those companies, and then evolved into working with bigger companies. And then I thought, well, I'll go and build out an investment bank because that will give me access to a whole range of things. And so spent quite a big chunk of my time doing that, made that global. And, I spent in that period, used that opportunity to actually go and do things in parts of the world where I thought there was, big things were happening, including China. So I've spent 20 years plus in China. Got invited to be part of a whole bunch of policy setting and sort of directional groups, which actually helped frame my thinking. So, but effectively, the short version is the last 25 odd years I've been an entrepreneur, like many of the people I work with, and building up things that make a difference. So how do you see impact investing evolving over the next couple of years and then into the 2030s and beyond?
Well, I think I know that there'll be more and more money going into it and more focus going into it for sure, right? Again, in 20 years' time, I hope, and I think we will get quite close, we'll get to the point where a big chunk of the investor universe just automatically incorporates impact and into their decision-making up front, but also then the measurement at the back end of that. And again, one example I give quite often, I should give credit to the person who said it. Sir Ronald Cohen is actually a very well-known person in the UK who developed effectively as one of the very first venture capitalists in the UK. And he gave a wonderful speech which I heard once, which was, I don't want to be have engraved on my gravestone when all my family come around my gravestone to think about me and it says, I generated 30% internal rates of return. That would not be a great sort of eulogy for what I've actually achieved in the world. But what he then said also in the speech was that if we go back to the market crash in 1929 and the depression that followed. Subsequently, what came out was that a lot of the crash was actually effectively caused by fraud in financial reporting. So, a significant number of the companies that actually blew up had just been, manipulating their books. And part of the problem was that there were no generally accepted accounting standards. So the trigger for the change towards, now we have globally recognized accounting standards, maybe not always applied exactly the same way, but they're there and everybody accepts them. And you want to report profit, you want to report investment returns. Those are the standards. And we're sort of at the same stage now, in my view. This is what Sir Ronald Cohen said as well, which is that we're trying to work out how to get these generally accepted reporting standards for impact, right? And in the middle of this, because we're still trying to work it out, there's a lot of greenwashing and people reporting things in one way or another way. But in 20 years, we'll have solved it, I hope, right? And there's nothing like a good crisis or two or three to actually focus people's minds. And unfortunately, humanity, sometimes has to, or often, always almost, has to be in crisis to actually want to shift. So what have we had in Australia, right? Huge bushfires, which almost burnt down parts of Australia, and you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you in Sydney. And 2 months later, a global pandemic. So, it's getting, it's like in our face. We have to do something about it. So again, as I said, I'm optimistic, Alex, always, that we can actually we can work it out.
Yeah, well, I was going to say before, I know some people who say they're older and they say, they're very successful, but they say they've lost faith in humanity when they see what the young people are doing today, when they see how things have changed. But, I mean, it's the sort of things you've spoken about that restore faith in humanity. And clearly, you're going to be leaving quite an incredible legacy in the decades to come when you're no longer with us. And I hope that's many decades away.
Well, I've in terms of young people, I'm excited, right? Because it's just I've got 4 children, and they're wired differently in a way. They've got some. I mean, my oldest son is deep in the social impact space too. So some stuff might have rubbed off, or he probably worked it out himself. But it's a driver, right? It's a fundamental driver. It's far more important, to his generation to really understand all of that upfront, and they're happy to trade off financial for impact. It's really great to see.
Yeah. Then my second last question is to simply ask you, what is the best piece of advice that you've received in life to help you get where you are today?
Surround yourself with the right people. Be around the right people.
Yeah, well, that's very true. I mean, they always say if you want to see how someone's going to turn out, take a look at their closest 5 friends, and that'll give you a very clear picture. Yeah. So, it's definite truth in that. And so, what is your final message to iTWire viewers and readers, and to your current and future partners, customers, and investment prospects?
We live in exciting times. There's a famous Chinese proverb which says,
we live in interesting times.
Yeah. Disruptive, interesting times are actually the most exciting times to be alive. We are, and technology done well makes it even more exciting. I just put a caution that technology without really understanding the human impact of that technology, does not deliver the ultimate what it could do. So we have to bring these two together. It's not just about scientists; it's also about sociologists and philosophers. Need to come together, but. Now, the leading message is we live in exciting times. Each individual can influence in their circle and their circle of energy almost. They can make a big difference. And if every single human on the world, on our planet, actually decided to do that and did that every day, wow, what a different planet we would have. So encourage people to give it a go. Don't be held back by fear. Think about the possibilities and the optimism that is possible out there and go for it.
Well, Barry Palte, founder and chairman of EQ Capital Partners and an impact investor of many decades standing. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for explaining it. Thank you for sharing all the amazing things that you're doing. And I do hope we can talk again in the future.
My pleasure, Alex. I really enjoyed it. I'm happy to do it again. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.